Hello and welcome to the My School channel. My name is Angela, and in this video we're going to continue the government topic by topic video lesson. So we're moving on to French Colonial Administration, where we're going to talk about how the French colonized West Africa. So please stay with us, don't go anywhere, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the My School channel. Like I said earlier, we're moving on to French Colonial Administration. So let's dive right into it. Alright, so here's a list of things we'll be discussing. We're going to begin with the discussion of French Colonial Administration in French West Africa. We're going to discuss the features of the administration, the policy of assimilation, the reason for the failure of that policy, the Brazzaville Conference, the policy of association, and the Loi Cadre system. So let's begin with a discussion of French Colonial Administration. So the primary goal of the French in West Africa was the mission civilisatrice or civilizing mission. According to the French, the higher races have a right over the lower races and they have a duty of civilizing the inferior races. So this is different from the British goal in West Africa. Their goal was primarily economic, like we discussed in the previous video lesson. But for the French, their goal was to civilize West Africa. Although they have been in French West Africa earlier on, their colonial mission did not begin until the late 19th century. They conquered and organized the territories into a federation known as French West Africa. So French West Africa was made up of 8 colonial territories, which included Senegal, French Sudan, which is now known as Mali, French Guinea, which is now known as Guinea, Ivory Coast or Côte d'Ivoire, Mauritania, Upper Volta, which is now known as Burkina Faso, Dahomey, which is now Benin Republic, and Niger. These were the territories that became the federation known as French West Africa in the 19th and 20th century. So the federation existed from 1895 until 1958, and its capital was in St. Louis in Senegal, until in 1902, and then Dakar until the federation's collapse when they began to gain independence very close to the 1960s. Now let's move on to the next slide. Alright, as the French, like other British territories, pursued their paths in the scramble for Africa in the 1880s and 90s, they conquered large inland areas and at first ruled them either as part of the Senegal colony or as independent entities. Okay, so we talked about how earlier on, most of those European merchants, they settled along the coast of West Africa. So this is where they started in. So Senegal is around this part. So this is where most of the French merchants settled in. So when they began their colonial mission, they began that in Senegal, the colony of Senegal. They made Senegal a colony, just like they made Lagos a crown colony. And then when they now moved into the inland regions, they were now governing these inland regions, but they were governing it from Senegal. So this is how the French West African colony was established. These conquered territories were usually governed by French army officials and dubbed military territories. So during the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85, France obtained majority of the West African territories and indeed most of African territories. So before then, they were using military leaders to conquer the territories in French West Africa. You understand that the French people, their mission was to civilize West Africa, and some people may not be okay with that, especially with the fact that most of their African culture were eroded at that time. So they needed military officials to help to establish their colonies within these territories. So the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85, as we discussed in the previous video lesson, it was a conference that was set up to discuss how Africa will be partitioned among the various colonial masters, the British, the French, the Portuguese, and the rest of them. So French acquired most of these French West African territories, the territories we discussed in the previous slide. So in the late 1890s, the French began to rein in the territorial expansion. They stopped their territorial expansion. So they now started to focus on the ones that they've already acquired and instead began to govern the ones they have conquered. France established a loose federation of her colonies with headquarters in Dakar, Senegal. So Senegal was the capital of French West Africa. That is where they governed all of these territories from. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, the first Governor General of Senegal was named in 1895, but in 1904, his powers were expanded as he had the responsibility of overseeing the entire Federation of French West Africa. So the Governor General in Senegal was in charge of the entire French West Africa. His power was expanded in 1904. That is when they now decided to name this entire region the Federation of French West Africa. Unlike the other territories in French West Africa, Senegal was a colony. The inhabitants of this colony were regarded as full French citizens with equal political rights. Just like the Lagos Crown Colony, the residents were regarded as British citizens, right? But the difference is that these French citizens in Senegal had equal political rights as the normal Frenchmen in France. So they could vote in parliamentary elections, the parliamentary elections that are held in France, and were entitled to elect a deputy who would represent them in the French parliaments. So they were trying to bring them into the French Empire at the time. Africans in other territories in French West Africa were regarded as French subjects, just like the protectorates in British West Africa were regarded as subjects. They were not given that full citizenship as those in the Lagos colony. So it's the same thing for Senegal and other territories in French West Africa. So they lacked the rights before the law. They lacked property rights. They lacked the right to travel, to dissent, or vote. All of these rights belonged to those people who were living in Senegal at that time. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so we're going to discuss the system of administration in French West Africa. The French adopted the circular system where the territories of French West Africa were divided into provinces or cercles, each headed by an European commandant du cercle or cercle commander. Okay, so it was an European leader that they had in each of these territories, each of the 8 territories within the Federation of French West Africa. Then each cercle is further divided into cantons, each of which consists of several villages. These cantons were headed by a chief. So you can see a federal structure within that federation. At the federal level, you have the Governor General at the top. Then you had governors for each of the territories. Then within the territories, you had provinces, which was headed by cercle commanders. As we can see here, this is the hierarchy. The Governor General is at the top of that hierarchy. He was a French official and his headquarters was in Dakar, Senegal. Then we have governors, which were French officials who held the territories, each of the 8 territories within the Federation of French West Africa. Then we have the cercle commander, French officials who held the provinces within the territory. Then we have cantons and village chiefs who were Africans. So these were the only African leaders we had at that time. They are appointed to head the cantons and villages within the provinces. All right, so let's look at the functions of the cercle commander. The cercle commander had tremendous amounts of power over the lives of the Africans under them. The following were their powers. They controlled the economic and political life of their territories. They had the right to arrest, to try, to punish and imprison the subjects, the French subjects. They had the right to requisition forced labor, usually limited to able-bodied men for a few weeks a year. So when they requisition forced labor, what they mean is that they get them to do some jobs for the French people without pay, with little to no pay, right, for a few weeks within the year. Then the chiefs within the villages and the cantons, they were Africans appointed by French officials for their loyalty to France, regardless of their right to local power. So they were not legitimate leaders in that sense, because unlike the British people who made use of traditional rulers and then they used the indirect rule system, the French people appointed people to rule them. Okay, these chiefs were not legitimate. They did not have the approval, the backing of the common people. So they were assigned to smaller territories known as cantons or villages and received instructions directly from the cercle commander. They are also subject to removal by French officials. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, in 1919, the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations Organization, gave Togo to France. So Togo was not originally part of French West Africa and was not part of French West Africa until its independence. Togo was administered by France, different from other French West African territories. When they were acquiring the various territories in Africa, nobody claimed Togo, and so the League of Nations had to assign Togo to France. So they governed it different from the Federation of French West Africa. In 1945, following the Second World War, the French government began a process of extending limited political rights to its colonies. They allocated 10 seats in the French Parliament to French West Africa. So this is very important. The Second World War played a very important role in French administration in the African territories and in other territories they acquired all over the world. They were at war with Germany at the time, and so they extended most of their political efforts and their economic resources to the war. And as a result of that, they did not have enough resources to continue to govern the territories, and so they decided to give more powers to the African leaders to represent themselves. So in 1946, a Ground Council of French West Africa was created in Dakar, Senegal, to allow more African representation in the administration of the colony. This council, however, had only consultative powers over the office of the Governor General. So this Ground Council was kind of like the executive that was formed to administer the affairs of the French West African colony. So the Administrative Council was headed by the Governor General in Senegal, and then it also comprised all the governors within the Federation. That is the governor of each of the territories, the 8 territories within the Federation. Then 10 representatives in the French Parliament, those people that were to represent the French West African citizens in the French Parliament in Paris. So officials from different parts of the Federation were also there, and 12 other members who represented various interests. This is what comprised the Ground Council of French West Africa, who were designed to administer the affairs of the colony. So let's move on to the next slide. All right, so we're going to discuss the features of the French Colonial Administration. One of the features is centralized administration. Just like in France, the French West African colony was a centralized administration. The French Colonial Administration was highly centralized, with authority coming from Paris. So the colonies were governed directly by French officials who reported to the French government. This centralization limited the voice and agency of the indigenous population. So in spite of the fact that they had settler commanders and other leaders in the provinces within the territory, they were still getting policy directly from the French Colonial Administration in Paris. They had no rights to make policies for themselves. They listened to the authority above them. So this is a centralized administration. The person at the top was the one who offered policy guidelines for the territories. Then there was also direct rule in French West Africa. France implemented a system of direct rule where the French government directly controlled the colonies through appointed officials. So unlike the British system of indirect rule, which worked through local traditional rulers, this system aimed to assimilate colonized people into French culture and legal systems. So unlike the indirect rule that we have in British West Africa, there was direct rule here. The reason for this is to ensure that the African subjects assimilate the culture of the French people. They become fully Frenchmen. Then there was also dual citizenship. Indigenous in French West Africa were either citizens or subjects of France. To be a citizen, the following requirement must be made. The individual has to be born in any of the 4 communes in Senegal. Senegal was divided into 4 communes, known as Gori, Dakar, Rufisque, and Saint Louis. So you have to belong to either of these 4 communes in order to gain citizenship of France. You must also provide evidence of good and attestable behavior from the French colonial government, and you must have served with the French colonial government for about 10 years. These are all the qualifications required in order for you to gain citizenship of France. So satisfying all this requirement means that such person holds both French and West African citizenship and has all the rights and privileges of a Frenchman. Now let's move on to the next slide. Okay, and that feature of the French colonial administration is that education was limited or restricted. The French colonial education system was highly restrictive and aimed at training a small elite to serve the colonial administration. The few schools built within the territories were concentrated in the 4 communes in Senegal, where most of the elites resided. Most African children were not given access to formal education, and the curriculum reinforced French superiority and colonial control. So this was the problem for the French West African people. Their nationalistic efforts were delayed as a result of this. Most of them were not educated. The education was restricted to those who were in Senegal, and the reason why they gave them this education was so that they can serve the French colonial administration. So those in all the other territories of French West Africa did not have access to formal education. The little education they had was the one that reinforced French superiority, the fact that the French were superior to them and they had to obey and respect the dictates of the French colonial masters. So this was a problem for the French West African people. They were not able to begin their nationalistic battle much earlier. Another feature is the indigenous policy and forced labor. So we're going to discuss this indigenous policy later on in this video lesson. The indigenous system was a set of laws that treated the indigenous population as subjects under French control. And these laws were harsh, and they limited the rights of Africans and subjected them to forced labor, to arbitrary arrest and punishments. Under this system, Africans were expected to work for little or no pay, and they were subjected to various forms of exploitation. So this indigenous policy was restricted to other territories of French West Africa aside from Senegal. And so these French subjects were subjected to forced labor, to arbitrary arrest, and so many other things. They were not treated like people with rights. So this was one of the features of French colonial administration. There was also no regard for traditional institutions. The French colonial administration showed little regard for the African traditional systems. Rather than govern through already existing traditional rulers, the French government chose to appoint chiefs who were loyal to the French, but who were not legitimate leaders of the indigenous populations. So traditional leaders, councils, and systems of law were undermined or completely disregarded in favor of French systems of governance and justice. So the problem here is that traditional rulers were not utilized by the French people. They wanted to assimilate all of the Africans into the French system so that they became fully Frenchmen. So as a result of that, most of their traditional institutions were eroded. The leaders that were appointed to govern them were not legitimate. They did not receive the backing of the people. And so it was very difficult for them to implement some of the policies that they have created to govern them. Now let's move on to the next one. All right, we have cultural heritage. Cultural heritage was disregarded in the French colonial administration. The French colonial administration placed little value on the cultural traditions, the languages, and the practices of the African people. So the French sought to civilize the indigenous population through the imposition of French culture, their language, and their education. Local customs and traditions and their language were seen as inferior to that of the French. So this is another problem. Most of the languages of the French West African people were eroded as a result of this French administration. Also, their customs and traditions were eroded. So that is one of the demerits of this French colonial administration. There was also the absence of local assemblies. In contrast to British colonies, where some form of local legislative assembly was established, the French colonial system did not allow for the creation of representative local assemblies. Colonies were governed by appointed French officials. Lawmaking was restricted to the French parliament in Paris. So the African leaders, the representatives, they were not allowed to make any decision to enforce any policy within the system. All of this, the lawmaking, the enforcement of policy were restricted to the French officials, who were the ones that made the policies that the people of French West Africa had to obey. So we've come to the end of this segment of the video lesson. I believe it was educative and enlightening. If you would like to continue on this journey with us, please go down to the link in the description below. This takes you to my school website where you can subscribe for the government topic by topic video lesson. There you can continue on this journey with us. So we're going to move on to the policy of assimilation. We're going to discuss the policy of assimilation and how it affected the people of French West Africa. Then we're also going to discuss the policy of assimilation and the Loi Cadre system. So I hope to see you there. I believe you enjoyed this content. If yes, please do not forget to hit the like button, click on the subscribe button, and lastly tap on the notification bell to get informed as soon as we release the next videos.